Do you think cavemen sat around reminiscing about the good old days before their ancestors came down from the trees?
On the single condition that you identify the body or the living person of the slave called Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus! I'm Spartacus!
This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is curled up in a ball of sleep on the couch. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. If you happen to like the podcast, you can follow it on Twitter. TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle, and it's also on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist. You can email me at trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. Show notes for this and most other episodes can be found at tparkatheist.blogspot.com. Don't forget to rate the show on iTunes. This is a Bible Myths episode where I read a chapter or two from T.W. Doan's Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions. Next episode may or may not be a news episode. Basically, I've been not happy with how they've come out, so I'm going to rework some things before I post one, because I've cut like 10 episodes that were supposed to be news episodes, and I just listened to them and said fuck it and deleted them and started all over. And that's why last week that's why you got 2 and now 3 Bible Myths episodes in a row, because I've got to work the kinks out of it. And in this case, it's kind of makes sense, because since I had to split this chapter up into more than one episode, it keeps the continuity going, I guess you could say. And if you happen to like these Bible Myths episodes, you might want to check out The Ark Before Noah by Irving Finkel. You might remember this story from back in January of this year about the discovery of a Babylonian clay tablet, which had the oldest known story of the flood myth. I've listened to the audio book of Finkel's The Ark Before Noah, and I have to say, while it is not for the faint-hearted, it is definitely worth a listen. It is essentially a college course on the subject. Finkel first saw the tablet when a gentleman brought it into the British Museum on one of their Ask an Expert days. When Finkel read the opening lines, he looked up at the gentleman and told him, basically, "This is perhaps the most important tablet I have ever seen, and it looks to be the oldest version of the flood myth to ever be discovered." The owner of the tablet essentially said, "Oh, how fascinating," and proceeded to rebox it and left the museum with it. That was in 1985. Finkel, to his credit, kept after the owner to let him see it again and managed to finally convince him in 2009. Personally, if I were Finkel, I'd have tackled the son of a bitch, and said, "You are not leaving here with that. That is hugely important." Anyways, the tablet dates from roughly 2000 BC, but Finkel suspects that the flood story is probably from around 3000 BC or older. And the story on the tablet is only 60 lines. Why 60 lines? Because the number 60 was sacred to the Babylonians. That's why. Finkel's book, after discussing how he found the tablet, moves on to his educational background. He had to learn German and French because when he was in college there were no cuneiform dictionaries in English. A history of the region and details of the various languages which used cuneiform. There's 3, I believe, or 4, and then there's some dialects involved in there as well. It is entertaining but dense. Finkel goes into a lot of detail about the ancient world, which is good, as you'll need that information later on. He then goes over the various flood myths from that part of the world and illustrates quite deftly how they can trace their origins to the tablet, which he first saw back in 85 and calls the Ark tablet. And he also shows how the most likely site that it would have been claimed for the Ark to have touched down would have been in the Zagros Mountains in modern-day Iran, Iraq, though there is another possibility as well. I can't remember the name, but it's a mountain in Turkey, and it is not Mount Ararat. It's Mount Judi, that's right, Judi. The mountain, he names the mountain in the Zagros Mountains, but I can't find the name. I mean, I listened to it, so I don't have the spelling, and I Googled around and tried to find various, I found the mountain range on the internet and various sites, but they don't name the peaks, or the peaks that they do have named don't match up with the name he gives. I don't know if this is a case of, like the British saying Peking when the rest of the world says Beijing, or if there's something else involved. Okay. The audiobook version is great because Finkel himself reads it along with Gareth Armstrong. Finkel reads the bulk of the text with Armstrong handling the quotations from ancient documents. That makes it easy not only to get through the spots where it gets a little tough, but it also lets you know that when he's quoting some kind of document, whether it be an ancient one or a modern discussion of ancient Babylonia. I would recommend that no matter what your level of interest, you start with the audiobook and then shift to a written version if you're really fascinated by the subject. Because if I had to, there are sections in the beginning where if I was reading them, it would have been a little tough to get through. That's not Finkel's fault, as there's really no way to adequately discuss the subject matter unless you're certain your audience has the appropriate background info, and Finkel does make it interesting where he can, and it generally is. One of the little trivia notes that Finkel puts is that he was going through some tablets in the museum and discovered the rules for the Royal Game of Ur. And he was telling everybody about it, and he was saying, this is amazing. I wish we knew what the game board looked like, because here's the rules. We now know how to play it. And he kept talking about it, and one of the other researchers in the British Museum came up to him and says, I found the board game. It's graffiti scratched onto a statue we've got in one of our displays. And he didn't believe her. So she winds up dragging him by the ear down to the exhibit and showing him the statue in the case. And since then, other statues have turned up that also have the same game board scratched into it. Finkel himself has written a pretty interesting book. I mean, it's for kids. It's thin on games from ancient times. That it's unfortunately out of print, so it's not necessarily easy. Well, it is kind of easy to get. They have it on Amazon fairly cheap, but his other book on games, which is larger, is out of print, and that's like $100. So I don't know. I would be interested in reading them just to see what the ancient board games were like. Anyways, I'll have links to the books and everything in the show notes. On to Bible myths and their parallels in other religions. It's a work written in the late 1800s which attempts to show that many of the stories in the Bible did not originate with the Bible and in fact predate it by a number of centuries. So far as I know, biblical scholarship has generally confirmed that Doane was right about what he wrote, and much of what he says raises rather pointed questions about the Bible and the religions it has influenced over the centuries. You don't need to listen to previous episodes to understand what's going on, but you can download previous episodes at trailerparkatheist.libsyn.com. You can find a free digital version of the book at books.google.com or at archive.org or gutenberg.org. And one of the things I want to interject, because I forgot to mention that when I was talking about Finkel's book on the flood, he takes that tablet and, like I said, there's only 60 lines, and he breaks down a lot of it in different manners, literary, technical, etc., etc. Neat thing is he can pull out a line and then insert that line verbatim into other versions of the flood myth, and you realize, that those flood myths absolutely had to come from this tablet. because, literally it is a word-for-word matchup, or, it's a minor word swapped or missing. One final thing about the Ark Before Noah. Finkel mentions that BBC is doing a documentary about it where they reconstruct the Ark as described. It's a coracle, which is basically a round boat made out of... it's like a giant version of a rope basket covered with pitch or tar on generally just the outside, but sometimes the inside as well. No idea if they're making a full-size one, which would be the size of a football field, or if they're going to make a small model, a scaled-down version. It is... I've looked. I don't see any mention of it anywhere on the internet. So I see things talking about it being shot, but nothing about it being released or having aired. So I'm guessing they're still editing it or producing it, and that it'll come out at a later date. Hopefully, it'll be easy for us in the States here to see, because it sounds really interesting. All right, now finally, let's get to Bible myths. Okay. Now, as you recall, we had just finished up giving a brief history of the Pentateuch, and this is the paragraph before where I stopped, so it'll kind of blend in, hopefully jog your memory. We shall now, after giving a brief history of the Pentateuch, refer to the legends of which we have been treating, and endeavor to show from whence the Hebrews borrowed them. The first of these is the creation and fall of man. Egypt, the country out of which the Israelites came, had no story of the creation and fall of man, such as we have found among the Hebrews. They, therefore, could not have learned it from them. The Chaldeans, however, as we saw in our first chapter, had this legend, and it is from them that the Hebrews borrowed it. The account which we have given of the Chaldean story of the creation and fall of man was taken, as we stated, from the writings of Berosus, the Chaldean historian, who lived in the time of Alexander the Great, 356 to 325 BC. And as the Jews were acquainted with the story some centuries earlier than this, his works do not prove that these traditions were in Babylonia before the Jewish captivity, and could not afford testimony in favor of the statement that the Jews borrowed this legend from the Babylonians at that time. It was left for Mr. George Smith of the British Museum to establish, without a doubt, the fact that this legend was known to the Babylonians at least 2,000 years before the time assigned for the birth of Jesus. The cuneiform inscription discovered by him while on an expedition to Assyria, organized by the London Daily Telegraph, was the means of doing this. And although by far the greatest number of these tablets belong to an age of Assurbanipal, Assurbanipal, who reigned over Assyria in BC 670, it is acknowledged on all hands that these tablets are not the originals, but are only copies from earlier texts. The Assyrians acknowledge themselves that this literature was borrowed from Babylonian sources, and of course it is to Babylonia we have to look to ascertain the approximate dates of the original documents. Footnote is... Come on. Scroll down, you piece of crap. Smith Chaldean Account of Genesis, pages 22 and 29. Now, allow me to interject. Finkel mentions this expedition of Smith's in his book, and he gives some advice based on what happened to Smith, because Smith is over in Iraq and Iran in the 1800s, and at the start of the digging season finds some fabulous tablets, sends a message to the Daily Telegraph, says, hey, I found some pretty cool shit, and they're like, great, come on home. And Smith, they figured that's it. He found everything he needed to find that could be found and bring him on home. And Smith's like, oh, no. So Finkel says, if you're out in the field doing expedition work, you don't tell anybody anything that you found anything until near the end of your expedition, because otherwise they'll cut your funding off in the middle of your expedition. Oh, Christ. Looks like somebody's cutting their grass. Hope you can't hear that too. Hope it's not too loud. All right. Back to the text. Mr. Smith then shows from fragments of the cuneiform account of the creation and fall, which have been discovered, that in the period from BC 2000 to 1500, the Babylonians believed in a story similar to that in Genesis. It is probable, however, says Mr. Smith, that this legend existed as traditions in the country long before it was committed to writing, and some of these traditions exhibited great difference in details, showing that they had passed through many changes. And I forgot to mention this, Finkel talks about how the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Chaldeans, all were very, very meticulous in their note. In the tablets that they copied, and they would, as modern scholars do now, they would indicate this is a fragment, can't read it, and they would give you they numbered the lines in the tablets to try and keep from making mistakes, and they had a coding system. I can't remember the exact phrases they would use, but the phrase would be such that it says, okay, I found that it was screwed up in my copy that I have, and they had another phrase which meant, okay, the guy who wrote the copy I'm copying from says that it was screwed up in his copy. So they tried their best to document this stuff in such a manner as to reduce the amount of errors that would follow along. Some still got in. He says occasionally you'll find notes down the side of a tablet indicating, where somebody says, hey, I screwed up, I forgot a line, put it in here. Just something that really has bearing on this, that Doan doesn't go into a great deal of detail about, and I thought it needed to be mentioned. Professor James Ferguson, in his celebrated work on tree and serpent worship, says the two chapters which refer to this, i.e., the garden, the tree, and the serpent, as indeed the whole of the first 8 of Genesis, are now generally admitted by scholars to be made up of fragments of earlier books or earlier traditions belonging, properly speaking, to Mesopotamia rather than to Jewish history, the exact meaning of which the writers of the Pentateuch seem hardly to have appreciated when they transcribed them in the form in which they are now found. John Fiske says the story of the serpent in Eden is an Aryan story in every particular. The notion of Satan as the author of evil appears only in later books composed after the Jews had come into close contact with Persian ideas. Footnote: Myths and Mythmakers, page 112. Professor John W. Draper says, in the old legends of dualism, the evil spirit was said to have sent a serpent to ruin paradise. These legends became known to the Jews during their Babylonian captivity. Footnote: Draper, Religion and Science, page 62. Professor Goldzier also shows in his mythology among the Hebrews that the story of the creation was borrowed by the Hebrews from the Babylonians. He also informs us that the notion of the Bor, B-O with a hat, R-E with a hat, and Yozer, Y-O with a hat, S-E with a hat, R, creator, the term used in the cosmogony in Genesis as an integral part of the idea of God, are first brought into use by the prophets of the captivity. Thus, also, the story of the Garden of Eden, as a supplement to the history of the creation, was written down at Babylon. Finkel not discussing this, he does do some linguistic traces and says, look, here's a word. It's spelled this way in cuneiform. It has this meaning, this pronunciation, and it is nearly identical to this Hebrew word, which shows up in myth. He expands he does talk a bit about the other influences on the Old Testament that the Babylonians had on the Jews, besides them copying the flood myth from them. He focuses, of course, on the flood myth because he's got that book, but he does do other things. Strange as it may appear, after the Genesis account, we may pass through the whole Pentateuch and other books of the Old Testament clear to the end, and we'll find the story of the Garden of Eden and fall of man is hardly alluded to, if at all. That I didn't know. Lengerke, Lengkerke, says, one single certain trace of the employment of the story of Adam's fall is entirely wanting in the Hebrew canon after the Genesis account. Adam, Eve, the serpent, the woman's seduction of her husband, and such are all images to which the remaining words of the Israelites never again reoccur. This circumstance can only be explained by the fact that the first chapters of Genesis were not written until after the other portions had been written. It is worthy of notice that this story of the fall of man, upon which the whole orthodox scheme of a divine Savior or Redeemer is based, was not considered by the learned Israelites as fact. They simply looked upon it as a story which satisfied the ignorant, but which should be considered as allegory by the learned. Rabbi Maimonides, Maimonides, Moses ben Maimon, one of the most celebrated of the rabbis, says on this subject, we must not understand or take in a literal sense what is written in the book on the creation, nor form of it the same ideas which are participated by the generality of mankind. Otherwise, our ancient sages would not have so much recommended to us to hide the real meaning of it and not to lift the allegorical veil which covers the truth contained therein. When taken in its literal sense, the work gives the most absurd and extravagant ideas of the deity. Whosoever should divine its true meaning ought to take great care in not divulging it. This is a maxim repeated to us by all our sages, principally concerning the understanding of the work of the 6 days. And I am going to bookmark that. Philo, a Jewish writer. Oh, fuck you. Sorry, the damn PC doesn't want to add the bookmark there. There was a problem adding your bookmark. Really? What would be that problem? I don't know. Now, why do you have a problem? You don't tell me. You just fuck up. Thank you, Google. Philo, a Jewish writer, contemporary with Jesus, held the same opinion of the character of the sacred books. He has made 2 particular treatises bearing the title of The Allegories, and he traces back to the allegorical sense of the tree of life, the rivers of paradise, and other fictions of Genesis. Okay, and I have missed I missed a footnote in there. There we go. Let me get to the first footnote I mentioned. Much of the Old Testament, which Christian divines, in their ignorance of Jewish lore, have insisted on receiving and interpreting literally, the informed rabbis never dreamed of regarding as anything but allegorical. The literalists they call fools. The account of the creation was one of the portions which the unlearned were especially forbidden to meddle with. Greg, the Creed of Christendom. Excuse me, Greg, the Creed of Christendom, page 80. And the footnote I was actually supposed to read was quoted by Dupuy, Origin of Religious Belief, pages 226. Okay. Back to the text, many of the early Christian fathers declared that in the story of the creation and fall of man, there was but an allegorical fiction. Among these may be mentioned St. Augustine, who speaks of it in his City of God, and also Origen, who says, "What man of sense will agree with the statement that the first, second, and third days, in which the evening is named and the morning, were without sun, moon, and stars? What man is found such an idiot as to suppose that God planted trees in paradise like a husbandman? I believe that every man must hold these things for images under which a hidden sense is concealed." Footnote quoted by Dunlap, Mysteries of Adonai, page 176. See also Bunsen, Keys of St. Peter, page 406. Origen believed outright, as it is now almost universally admitted, that the stories of the Garden of Eden, the Elysian Fields, the Garden of the Blessed, and so on, which were the abode of the blessed, where grief and sorrow could not approach them, where plague and sickness could not touch them, were founded on allegory. These abodes of delight were far away in the west, where the sun goes down beyond the bounds of the earth. They were the golden islands sailing in a sea of blue, the burnished clouds floating in the pure ether. In a word, the Elysian Fields are the clouds at eventide. The picture was suggested by the images drawn from the phenomena of sunset and twilight. Eating of the forbidden fruit was simply a figurative mode of expressing the performance of the act necessary to the perpetuation of the human race. The tree of knowledge was a phallic tree, and the fruit which grew upon it was a phallic fruit. See Westop and Wake's Phallic Worship. In regard to the story of the deluge, we have already seen that Egyptian records tell nothing of a cataclysmical deluge, and that the land was never visited by other than its annual beneficent overflow of the river Nile. Also that the pharaoh Khufu Cheops was building his pyramid, according to Egyptian Chronicle, when the whole world was under the waters of a universal deluge, according to the Hebrew Chronicle. This is sufficient evidence that the Hebrews did not borrow the legend from the Egyptians. We have also seen in the chapter that treated of this legend that it corresponded in all the principal features with the Chaldean account. We shall now show that it was taken from this. Mr. Smith discovered on the site of Nineveh during the years 1873 to 74 cylinders belonging to the early Babylonian monarchy from 2500 to 1500 BC, which contained the legend of the flood. Footnote, see Assyrian Discoveries, pages 167, 168, and Chaldean account of Genesis. Back to the main text, and which we gave in chapter 2. This was the foundation for the Hebrew legend, and they learned it at the time of the captivity. Footnote, upon the carrying away of the Jews to Babylon, they were brought into contact with a flood of Iranian as well as Chaldean myths and adopted them without hesitation. S. Baring Gould, Curious Myths, page 316. The myth of the Deucalion, the Grecian hero, was also taken from the same sources. The Greeks learned it from the Chaldeans. We read in Chambers' Encyclopedia that it was at one time extensively believed, even by intelligence scholars, that the myth of Deucalion was a corrupted tradition of the Noachian deluge. But this untenable opinion is now all but universally abandoned. This idea was abandoned after it was found that the Deucalion myth was older than the Hebrew. What was said in regard to the Eden story not being mentioned in other portions of the Old Testament, save in Genesis, also applies to this story of the deluge. Nowhere in the other books of the Old Testament is found any reference to this story, except in Isaiah, where the waters of Noah are mentioned, and in and in Ezekiel, where simply the name of Noah is mentioned. We stated in chapter, I guess it's chapter 2, it's bad scan. We stated in chapter 2 that some persons saw in this story an astronomical myth, although not generally admitted. Yet there are very strong reasons for believing this to be the case. According to the Chaldean account, which is the oldest one known, there were 7 persons saved in the ark. Footnote 2, see chapter 2. Okay, no big deal there. Back to the text. There were also 7 persons saved, according to some of the Hindu accounts. That this referred to the sun, moon, and 5 planets looks very probable. We have also seen that Noah was the 10th patriarch, and Zithrus, who is the Chaldean hero, was the 10th king. Now, according to the Babylonian table, their zodiac contained 10 gods called the 10 zodiac gods. They also believe that whenever all the planets met in the sign of Capricorn, the whole world was overwhelmed with a deluge of water. Oh, shit, man. Fucking glad thing the hippies haven't got a hold of that idea. It was bad enough with the whole 2012 business. The Hindus and other nations had a similar belief. It is well known that the Chaldeans were great astronomers. When Alexander the Great conquered the city of Babylon, the Chaldean priests boasted to the Greek philosophers who followed his army that they had continued their astronomical calculations through a period of more than 40,000 years. Although this statement cannot be credited, yet the great antiquity of Chaldea cannot be doubted, and its immediate connection with Hindustan or Egypt is abundantly proved by the little that is known concerning its religion and by the few fragments that remain of its former grandeur. Yes, Fuzznuts, I will pick you up. Come on. Ow! Don't claw the titty. There. You comfortable? I hope so. Yes, you're so sweetie. In regard to the story of the Tower of Babel, little need be said. This, as well as the story of the creation and fall of man and the deluge, was borrowed from the Babylonians. And Finkel talks about the Tower of Babel, and he mentions that when it was an astronomical observatory, and that when the Jews were there, it was in use. It wasn't rubble. It seemed, back to the text, it seems, says George Smith, from the indications in the cuneiform inscriptions that there happened in the interval between 2000 and 1850 BC a general collection of the development of the various traditions of the creation, flood, Tower of Babel, and other similar legends. These legends were, however, traditions before they were committed to writing, and were common in some form to all the country. The Tower of Babel, or the confusion of tongues, is nowhere alluded to in the Old Testament outside of Genesis, where the story is related. The next story in order is the trial of Abraham's faith. In this connection, we have shown similar legends taken from Grecian mythology, which legends may have given the idea to the writer of the Hebrew story. It may appear strange that the Hebrews should have been acquainted with Grecian mythology, yet we know this was the case. The fact is accounted for in the following manner. Many of the Jews taken captive at the Edomite sack of Jerusalem were sold to the Grecians, who took them to their country. While there, they became acquainted with the Grecian legends, and when they were returned from the islands of the sea, as they called the western countries, they brought them to Jerusalem. Footnote. See Inman Ancient Faiths, Volume 2, page 685. Okay. Back to the text. This legend, as we have stated in the chapter which treated of it, was written at the time when the Mosaic Party and Israel were endeavoring to abolish human sacrifices and other, quote, abominations, unquote, and the author of the story invented it to make it appear that the Lord had abolished them in the time of Abraham. The earliest Targum, Footnote, Targum, the general term for the Abrahamic versions of the Old Testament, back to the text, knows nothing about the legend, showing that the story was not in the Pentateuch at the time this Targum was written. So, in other words, the oldest copies that we have don't mention anything about Abraham taking Isaac up to the mountains intending to sacrifice him because he worshipped a psychotic god. Okay. We have also seen that a story written by a Sanchoniathon, Sanchoniathon, about BC 1300, of one Saturn whom the Phoenicians called Israel, bore a resemblance to the Hebrew legend of Abraham. Now, Count de Volnay tells us that a similar tradition prevailed among the Chaldeans, and that they had the history of one Zerbian, which means rich in gold. Footnote, in Genesis 23, verse 2, Abraham is called rich in gold and in silver. Back to the text, that corresponded in many respects with the history of Abraham. Footnote, see Volney's Researches in Ancient History, pages 144 to 147. Back to the text, it may then have been from the Chaldean story that the Hebrew fable writer got his idea. The next legend which we have examined was that of Jacob's vision of the ladder. We claim that it probably referred to the doctrine of the transmigration of souls from one body into another, and also gave the apparent reason for the invention of the story. The next story was the Exodus from Egypt and passage through the Red Sea, in which we showed from Egyptian history that the Israelites were turned out of the country on account of their uncleanness, and that the wonderful exploits recorded of Moses were simply copies of legends related to the sun god Bacchus. These legends came from the islands of the sea, and came in very handy for the Hebrew fable writers. They saved them the trouble of inventing. We now come to the story relating to the receiving of the 10 Commandments by Moses from the Lord on top of a mountain mid thunders and lightnings. All that is likely to be historical in this account is that Moses assembled not, indeed, the whole of the people, but the heads of the tribes, and gave them the code which he had prepared. Footnote, The Religion of Israel, page 49. Back to the main text. The marvelous portion of the story was evidently copied from that related of the lawgiver Zoroaster by the Persians, and the idea that there were 2 tables of stone with the law written thereon was evidently taken from the story of Bacchus, the lawgiver, who had his laws written on 2 tables of stone. The next legend treated was that of Samson and his exploits. Those who, like the learned of the last century, maintain that the pagans copied from the Hebrews may say that Samson was the model of all their similar stories. But now that our ideas concerning antiquity are enlarged, and when we know that Hercules is well known to have been the god Sol, whose allegorical history was spread among many nations long before the Hebrews were ever heard of, we are authorized to believe and to say that some Jewish mythologists, for what else are their so-called historians, composed the antidote of Samson by partly disfiguring the popular traditions of the Greeks, Phoenicians, and Chaldeans, and claiming that hero for his own nation. Footnote, in claiming the mighty man and lion killer as one of their own race, the Jews were simply doing what other nations had done before them. The Greeks claimed Hercules as their countryman, stated where he was born, and shown his tomb. The Egyptians affirmed that he was born in their country. See Tacitus, Annals, Book 2, Chapter LIX. Don't ask me, I'm not translating the Roman numerals. and so did many other nations. Normally I'd look that up, but tonight, fuck it. The Babylonian story of Isdubar, the lion killer who wandered to the regions of the blessed, the Grecian Elysium, who crossed a great waste of land, the desert of Libya, according to the Grecian mythos, and arrived at a region where splendid trees were laden with jewels, the Grecian garden of the Hesperides, is probably the foundation for the Hercules and other corresponding myths. This conclusion is drawn from the fact that although the story of Hercules was known in the island of Thasus by the Phoenician colony settled there 5 centuries before he was known in Greece, yet its antiquity among the Babylonians antedates that. The age of the legends of Isdubar among the Babylonians cannot be placed with certainty, yet the cuneiform inscriptions relating to this hero, which have been found, may be placed at about 2,000 years BC. Footnote, Chaldean account of Genesis, page 168 and 174, and Assyrian discoveries, page 167. Back to the text. As these stories were traditions, says Mr. Smith, the discoverer of the cylinders, before they were committed to writing, their antiquity as tradition is probably much greater than that. With these legends before them, the Jewish priests in Babylon had no difficulty in arranging the story of Samson and adding it to their already fabulous history. As the Reverend Dr. Isaac M. Wise remarks in speaking of the ancient Hebrews, they adopted forms, terms, ideas, and myths of all nations with whom they came in contact and, like the Greeks in their way, cast them all in a particular Jewish religious mold. We have seen in the chapter which treats of this legend that it is recorded in the book of Judges. This book was not written till after the first set of Israelites had been carried into captivity, and perhaps still later. After this we have Jonah swallowed by a big fish, which is the last legend treated. We saw that it was a solar myth known to many nations of antiquity. The writer of the book, whoever he may have been, lived in the 5th century before Christ, after the Jews had become acquainted and mixed with other nations. The writer of this wholly fictitious story, taking the prophet Jonah, who was evidently an historical personage, for his hero, was perhaps intending to show the loving kindness of Jehovah. We have now examined all the principal Old Testament legends, and after what has been seen, we think that no impartial person can still consider them historical facts. That so great a number of educated persons still do so seems astonishing in our way of thinking. They have repudiated Greek and Roman mythology with disdain. Why then admit with respect the mythology of the Jews? Ought the miracles of Jehovah to impress us more than those of Jupiter? We think not. They should all be looked upon as relics of the past. That Christian writers are beginning to be aroused to the idea that another tack should be taken, differing from the old, is very evident. This is clearly seen by the words of Professor Richard A. Armstrong, the translator of Dr. Knappert's Religion of Israel into English. In the preface of this work, he says, "It appears to me to be profoundly important that the youthful English mind should be faithfully and accurately informed of the results of modern research into the early development of the Israelite..." Why the fuck did they use this word? Israelitish religion. Deplorable and irreparable mischief will be done to the generation now passing into manhood and womanhood if their educators leave them ignorant or loosely informed on these topics, for they will then be rudely awakened by the enemies of Christianity from a blind and unreasoning faith in the supernatural inspiration of the Scriptures, and being suddenly and bluntly made aware that Abraham, Moses, David, and the rest did not say, do, or write what has been ascribed to them, they will fling away all care for the venerable religion of Israel and all hope that it can nourish their own religious life. How much happier will those of our children and young people be who learn what is now known of the actual origin of the Pentateuch and the writings from the same lips which have taught them that the prophets indeed prepared the way for Jesus, and that God is indeed our Heavenly Father. For these will, without difficulty, perceive that God's love is none the feebler, and that the Bible is no less precious because Moses knew nothing of the Levitical legislation, or because it was not the warrior monarch on his semi-barbaric throne, but some far later son of Israel, who breathed forth the immortal hymn of faith, the Lord is my shepherd, and I shall not want. Okay, I'll just point out here, what Doan is saying is that in the late 1800s, it appeared we were on the cusp of actually throwing off religious belief. Now, Nappert says, oh, well, when we realize that these are all allegorical stories in the Old Testament, we will be much happier and we'll have a better understanding of God, blah, blah, blah. Doan doesn't seem to think that. And look where we are now. We're in a world that is still dominated by religion. And over 120 years ago, almost 140 years ago, 50 years ago, they were saying, we need to get rid of we're on the edge, we're on the edge, we're on the edge, we're going to see a big shift in religious views. And it didn't happen. They thought it was going to happen, but it didn't. Clearly, those of us who are atheists, skeptics, secularists, what have you, should learn from this and think and realize that just because we see certain changes happening in our society doesn't mean that we are actually going to be free of religion anytime soon. And anybody who's watched the news lately, and I'm recording this on September 14th, ought to know why we are in such bad shape because of religion and the narrow-mindedness that is endemic in parts of our society that is so similar to that of religious belief. I'm talking about people who hold certain political philosophies. It doesn't matter what evidence you show them that, no, this belief is wrong, will still continue to cling to it. Okay, back to the text. For the benefit of those who may think that the evidence of plagiarism on the part of the Hebrew writers has not been sufficiently substantiated, we will quote a few words from Professor Max Mueller, who is one of the best English authorities on this subject that can be produced. In speaking of this, he says, "The opinion that the pagan religions were mere corruptions of the religion of the Old Testament, once supported by men of high authority and great learning, is now as completely surrendered to the attempts of explaining Greek and Latin as corruptions of Hebrew." Again, he says, as soon as the ancient language and religion of India became known in Europe, it was asserted that Sanskrit, like all other language, was to be derived from Hebrew, and the ancient religion of the Brahmins from the Old Testament. There was at that time an enthusiasm among Oriental scholars, particularly at Calcutta, and an interest for Oriental antiquities in the public at large, of which we, in these days of apathy for Eastern literature, can hardly form an adequate idea. Everybody wished to be the first in the field and to bring to light some of the treasures which were supposed to be hidden in the sacred literature of the Brahmins. No doubt the temptation was great, No one could look down for a moment into the rich mine of religious and mythological lore that was suddenly opened before the eyes of scholars and theologians without being struck by a host of similarities, not only in the languages, but also in the ancient traditions of the Hindus, the Greeks, and the Romans. And if at that time the Greeks and Romans were still supposed to have borrowed their language and their religion from Jewish quarters, the same conclusion could hardly be avoided with regard to the language and the religion of the Brahmins of India. The student of pagan religion, as well as Christian missionaries, were bent on discovering more striking and more startling coincidences in order to use them in confirmation of their favorite theory that some rays of primordial revelation or some reflection of the Jewish religion had reached the uttermost ends of the world. The result of all this is summed up by Professor Mueller as follows. Oops. I missed a footnote there. They even claimed that one of the lost tribes of Israel had found their way to America and had taught the natives Hebrew. And there's no indication if he's talking about Mormonism or not. Okay. Back to the main text. The result of all this is summed up by Professor Mueller as follows. It was the fate of all these pioneers not only to be left behind in the assault which they had planned, but to find that many of their approaches were made in a false direction and had to be abandoned. Footnote: The Science of Religion, pages 285 and 292. Before closing this chapter, oh, thank God, it's so long, we shall say a few words on the religion of Israel. It is supposed by many, in fact we have heard it asserted by those who should know better, that the Israelites were always monotheists, that they worshipped one God only, Jehovah. Footnote: It is an assumption of the popular theology and an almost universal belief in the popular mind that the Jewish nation was selected by the Almighty to preserve and carry down to later ages a knowledge of the one and true God. That the patriarchs possessed this knowledge, that Moses delivered and enforced this doctrine as the fundamental tenet of the national creed, and that it was, in fact, the perceived and distinctive dogma of the Hebrew people. This alleged possession of the true faith by one only people, while all surrounding tribes were lost in polytheism, or something worse, has been adduced by divines in general as a proof of the truth of the sacred history and of the divine origin of the Mosaic dispensation. Gregg, The Creed of Christendom, page 145. Even such authorities as Paley and Milman have written in this strain. See quotations from Paley's of Evidences of Christianity and Dean Milman's History of the Jews, made by Mr. Gregg in his Creed of Christendom, page 145. Something else. Somebody pointed out that the polytheistic religions were more tolerant of people of other beliefs than monotheistic religions are. So in other words, the Greeks didn't care if you were a Hebrew or a Chaldean or, a Hindu or whatever, but the Jews and Zoroastrians tended to get butthurt when they ran into somebody who didn't believe in the same God. I don't know how accurate that statement is, but it's an interesting thought. If the world had never, if Islam and Christianity and Judaism were never monotheistic religions, they all remained polytheistic, would the world be a less violent place? Something to think about. Anyways, back to the main text. This is altogether erroneous. They were not different from their neighbors, the heathen, so-called, in regard to their religion. In the first place, we know that they revered and worshipped a bull called Apis. Footnote, see the Bible for Learners, Volume 1, page 321, Volume 2, page 120, and Dunlap, Mysteries of Adonai, page 108. Just as the ancient Egyptians did. They worshipped the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the host of heaven. They worshipped fire and kept it burning on an altar, just as the Persians and other nations. There's footnotes, but they're like strings of text. They're just strings of books with page numbers. So I'm not going to read them because, it's like, see the Bible for learners, and then it says, see Dunlap's Son of Man and his spiritual history, Inman Ancient Faiths, and it gives the page numbers, and it just keeps referring back to those books over and over again. I will try to remember. There does look to be a footnote or two that is actually relevant, that has more than that, but if I can remember to find them, remember to read it when I can, I will. Otherwise, I'm sorry. Okay, back to where I was. They worshipped stones, revered an oak tree, and bowed down to images. They worshipped a queen of heaven called the goddess Astarte, or Melita, and burned incense to her. They worshipped Baal. Okay. Here is a footnote that I will actually read. Scroll down 20 feet to get to it. 9. The Bible for Learners, Volume 1, pages 21 to 25, 105, and 391. Okay, I'm going to skip the other text that he cites and get to the gist. Baal, Bel, or Belus was an idol of the Chaldeans and Phoenicians or Canaanites. The word Baal in the Punic language signifies Lord or Master. The name Baal is often joined with some other, as in Baal Berith, Baal Peor, Baal Zephon, and so on. The Israelites made him their god and erected altars to him on which they offered human sacrifices. And what is still more unnatural, they ate of the victims they offered. Bell's Pantheon, Volume 1, pages 113 and 114. That's just rather disgusting. So is that kosher? Okay, Moloch, back to the main text. Moloch and... Let me get to the back. Start that sentence again. They worshipped Baal, Moloch, Chemosh, and offered up human sacrifices to them, after which in some instances they ate the victim. Okay? It's got a string of footnotes and just, see Bible for Learners and see this and see that, and Bell's Pantheon, and it's the page number, so. But actually could have skipped that footnote and just read that little sentence. Oh well. It was during the captivity that idolatry ceased among the Israelites. The Babylonian captivity is clearly referred to in the book of Deuteronomy as the close of Israel's idolatry. There is reason to believe that the real genius of the people was first called into full exercise and put on its career of development at this time, that Babylon was a forcing nursery, not a prison cell, creating instead of stifling a nation. My wrong emphasis there. Change the meaning. The astonishing outburst of intellectual and moral energy that accompanied the return from the Babylonianish captivity attests the spiritual activity of that mysterious and momentous time. As Professor Goldzier says, the intellect of Babylon and Assyria exerted more than passing influence on that of the Hebrews, not merely touching it, but entering deep into it and leaving its own impression upon it. Wow, chicken, wow, wow. This impression we have already partly seen in the legends which they borrowed, and it may also be seen in the religious ideas which they imbibed. The Assyrian colonies which came and occupied the land of the tribes of Israel filled the kingdoms of Samaria with the dogma of the Magi, which very soon penetrated into the kingdom of Judah. Afterwards, Jerusalem being subjugated, the defenseless country was entered by persons of different nationalities who introduced their opinions, and in this way the religion of Israel was doubly mutilated. Besides, the priests and great men who were transported to Babylon were educated in the sciences of the Chaldeans and imbibed during a residence of 50 years nearly the whole of their theology. It was not until this time that the dogmas of the hostile genius, Satan, the angels of Michael, Uriel, Yar, Nisan, and so on, the rebel angels, the battle in heaven, the immortality of the soul, and the resurrection were introduced and naturalized among the Jews. Footnote: The Talmud of Jerusalem expressly states that the names of the angels and the months, such as Gabriel, Michael, Yar, Nisan, and so on, came from Babylon with the Jews. Gold's Year, page 319. There is no trace of the doctrine of the angels in the Hebrew scripture composed or written before the exile. Bunsen, the angel Messiah. The Jews adopted during the captivity the idea of angels, Michael, Raphael, Uriel, Gabriel, and so on. Night, Ancient Art and Mythology, page 54. See for further information on this subject Dr. Knappert's Religion of Israel or Professor Kuenen's, Kuenen, Religion of Israel. And that, I believe, yes, that's the end of the chapter, finally. Okay, and one thing I want to interject, a couple of things now, is that in his book, Finkel talks about how the Jews most likely became acquainted with the myth, and the Chaldeans the Babylonians and the Chaldeans had a very, very excellent educational system in place. He describes it in considerable detail in the book, and he cites biblical stories, and I forget chapter and verse and all that, where when the Jews are brought in to Babylon, the king of Babylon says, take the scribes, the scholars, and the best-looking men, send them to school for 3 years, and teach them our language, etc., etc. The point being that these individuals became officers of, the educational system in the courts and things like that. They were scribes, so they were valuable in all in all areas of society, since the population at large was not literate, but they would hire a scribe, and the scribe would say, okay, would write down business contracts and things like that for them. So since they trained the most, a large group of Jews that they had brought with them, it would be these individuals who picked up the stories and tales and things like that, and then later incorporated them into their own religious system. But as you can probably tell from the sound of my voice, I am glad this chapter is over. I couldn't have handled another few more pages of it. Okay, I'm going to babble just here for a few more minutes, and then I'm going to sign off and get to editing and doing other things around here. Those of you who were wondering, probably weren't, but if you remember last week, I mentioned that I was cooking some barbecue sauce, and I have to say that it's probably, it is the best barbecue sauce I've ever made, and it's probably some of the best food I've ever cooked. A couple of weeks ago, I heard about plum ketchup, and I said, that sounds awfully interesting, so I got the recipe, whipped up a batch, and found it to be incredibly tasty. So I did what any sane human being would do. I decided to experiment with it, and I found a barbecue sauce recipe, because I live in an area where vinegar-based barbecue sauces on pork are the norm. I tend to prefer a tomato-based barbecue sauce on beef. So, and it's not impossible to find like it once was, but you have a limited selection, and there's not any, or at least not that in my area, not any mom and pop barbecue shops that sell beef barbecue with a tomato-based sauce. There's all kinds of mom and pop places with a, they'll have whatever kind of barbecue they meat they serve. It's always a vinegar-based sauce. So I keep an eye out on tomato-based sauce recipes. And after having the plum ketchup, I said, I'm going to try this in a barbecue sauce. So got a recipe for barbecue sauce, for a Jack Daniel's barbecue sauce, and I ditched the Jack Daniels, put in Evan Williams, because I don't like Jack Daniels, and I wasn't going to waste a good bourbon on an experimental sauce. I have to say that the sauce, I grilled some beef ribs that I found last night, and I found some beef ribs, and then I grilled them last night. I have to say, anyways, that this barbecue sauce is just fan-fucking-tastic. I will post the recipe both for the plum ketchup and the barbecue sauce, and as I said, I used the plum ketchup for the barbecue sauce instead of the tomato-based ketchup. One thing that I will add is that for both recipes, you need to add cornstarch because they just don't thicken up like a tomato-based sauce does for some odd reason. I tried cooking it longer, both of them for longer than what the recipes call for. In both cases, I think I cooked it for like an hour to try and drive off more of the liquid, and it still wasn't enough to get it really thick unless I added cornstarch. But absolutely well worth it. I made today I made bacon Swiss burgers, which was fan-fucking-tastic. So, and I need to be losing weight, but here I am stuffing myself with food and making myself fatter. Okay, so that's it. There will be, I don't, if I get things restructured to where I'm able to do a news episode the way I like it, then there will be an episode most likely Wednesday. Otherwise, there will definitely be an episode posted next Sunday at the latest. It all just depends on how things go during the week. So, that's it for this episode of the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast. You can follow the show on Twitter. TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle, and it's also on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist. You can email me at trailerparkatheist@gmail.com. Show notes for this and most other episodes can be found at tparkatheist.blogspot.com. Don't forget to rate the show on iTunes. The next episode will be a news episode. To say goodnight, Fuzz-Nuts. Damned cat still asleep.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.